I hit the brakes so hard my seatbelt locked against my chest. My driveway was gone. Well, not gone, but blocked, completely sealed off by a car that had no business being there. It wasn't just some lazy, half-hearted parking job either. The car was planted right across the entrance, like a brick wall of metal and bad decisions. For a second, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what I was looking at. This had to be a mistake, right? Someone double-parked for a quick stop. But no one was inside. No flashing hazard lights. No sign of anyone coming back anytime soon. My jaw clenched. I worked a long shift. I was exhausted. And now, instead of parking and finally getting some rest, I was stuck dealing with this. I took a slow breath, trying to calm myself, but something in my gut told me, this wasn't just an accident. This was personal. I put my car in park, opened the door, and stepped out, my frustration rising with each second. The afternoon sun was beating down, and the heat made everything feel more intense, more suffocating. I walked up to the vehicle, studying it. It was a silver sedan, clean, no dents, nothing to suggest it was abandoned or broken down. It looked like it belonged to someone who thought they were entitled to leave their problems for other people to deal with. I glanced at the curb, checking for any empty spots. Plenty of space. They could have parked anywhere, literally anywhere, but instead, they chose to dump their car right in front of my house, blocking my way in like they owned the place. I scanned the houses around me. My neighborhood was quiet, but not the good kind of quiet. More like the nobody wants to get involved kind. Curtains shifted in one of the windows across the street. Someone was watching, but the moment I turned my head, the blinds snapped shut. I exhaled slowly. Great. I checked my phone, debating whether to call someone. The police? No, they'd take hours to respond to something like this, if they even showed up at all. A tow company? That would take time too, and I didn't feel like waiting all evening for them to arrive. Maybe the owner would come back soon, realize their mistake, and move the car before things got messy. But as the minutes passed, my patience thinned. I leaned against my car, arms crossed, waiting, watching. Then, movement. My neighbor, Greg, was stepping out of his house, stretching like he had all the time in the world. Greg. The one neighbor I didn't get along with. The one person on this street who always seemed to have a problem with me for no reason at all. The one who complained when I mowed my lawn too early. The one who made passive-aggressive comments about how my garbage cans were an eyesore when they were out for collection. And now, the one walking toward the blocked driveway with a smirk on his face. "You're blocking my driveway," I said, keeping my voice even. Greg took a slow, dramatic look at the car, then back at me. "Huh. Looks like it." I stared at him. He stared back. He wasn't even pretending to be surprised. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Move it," I said, my patience barely hanging on. He shrugged. "Can't." My fists clenched. "What do you mean you can't?" Greg sighed, shaking his head like I was the one being unreasonable. "It's my cousin's car. He parked it here while he ran some errands. Should be back soon." I took a step closer. "Then call him. Tell him to move it. Now." Greg tilted his head, pretending to think about it. "Nah. He won't be long. Just be patient." I could feel the anger rising in my chest. He was enjoying this. He wanted to get under my skin, to make me feel powerless in front of my own house. This wasn't about parking. This was about control. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "If it's not gone in the next 15 minutes, I'm towing it." Greg laughed. Actually laughed. "Go ahead. See if I care." That was it. That was all I needed to hear. If he thought I was bluffing, he was in for a surprise. I didn't say another word. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for a towing company I had used once before when an old junker had been left on my street for weeks. The woman on the other end picked up, and I wasted no time explaining the situation. "You want it removed ASAP?" she asked. "Yes," I said, my voice sharp. "How soon can you get here?" 20 minutes, she said. I glanced at Greg, who was still standing there, smirking like he had already won. Perfect. I hung up. Greg was still watching me, arms crossed, completely unbothered. "You really called a tow truck?" he asked, amused. I smiled. "You'll see." For a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Maybe he thought I was bluffing. Maybe he thought his cousin would get back before anything happened. Either way, he was wrong. I leaned against my car and waited. Greg didn't move. He stood there, watching, arms crossed, still convinced this was some kind of game. But as soon as he heard the distant rumble of a tow truck turning onto our street, his smirk finally started to fade. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I just watched as the tow truck rolled up, big and red, with a driver who looked like he didn't take nonsense from anyone. He pulled to a stop, hopped out, and glanced between me and the blocked driveway. "This the one?" he asked, jerking a thumb toward the car. I nodded. "Yep." Greg stepped forward, his smirk replaced with something else, something close to panic. "Whoa, hold on, let's not get crazy here," he said, holding up his hands. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so now it's a problem?" Greg glanced at the tow truck driver, then back at me. "My cousin's coming back any minute." The tow truck driver shrugged. "Then he can pick it up at the impound lot." Greg's face turned red. "You can't do this." I smiled. "Watch me." And just like that, the driver got to work. The chains rattled, the hydraulic lift engaged, and Greg could do nothing but stand there and watch as his cousin's car was hoisted up onto the truck. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, arms crossed, letting him feel every second of it. Greg finally turned to me, his voice lower, quieter. "This is gonna cost him a lot." I shrugged. Should have thought of that before blocking my driveway. And as the tow truck pulled away, taking the car with it, I finally exhaled. The battle wasn't over yet, I could tell by the way Greg was looking at me, but for now? I had won. Greg didn't say another word as he stormed back toward his house, but the way he moved told me this wasn't over. He was fuming, his shoulders stiff, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. I didn't care. I had every right to have that car towed, and if he wanted to throw a tantrum about it, that was his problem. I turned back to my house, finally able to pull into my driveway now that the obstruction was gone. The satisfaction should have felt better than it did. I should have been relieved. But something about Greg's reaction unsettled me. He wasn't just angry, he was plotting. The kind of anger that doesn't fade but simmers beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. I dismissed the thought. Let him stew. If he tried anything, I would deal with it when the time came. That night, I barely had time to unwind before I heard something outside. At first, it was subtle, just the faintest sound of movement near my driveway. I ignored it, convincing myself it was nothing, but then I heard the unmistakable crunch of gravel. Someone was out there. I moved to the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to see. My gut twisted. Greg stood at the edge of my driveway, hands in his pockets, staring at my house. Not moving. Not doing anything. Just standing there like some horror movie villain waiting for the right moment to make his move. I watched for a while, debating whether to confront him, but something told me that was exactly what he wanted. He wanted a reaction, a confrontation he could twist to make himself the victim. So I let the curtain fall back into place and walked away, refusing to give him the satisfaction. The next morning, I stepped outside to find something waiting for me. A single note, taped to my mailbox in messy, rushed handwriting. "You'll regret that." Short. To the point. And childish as hell. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head as I pulled it off and crumpled it in my hand. Greg thought he could intimidate me? That he could scare me into backing down? He was playing a game he wasn't ready for. If he wanted a fight, he was going to get one. I wasn't going to let some bitter neighbor with too much free time make my life miserable. I had work to do, and I wasn't about to waste another second worrying about his tantrum. For a few days, nothing happened. Greg kept his distance, and I almost let myself believe he had gone. But then small things started piling up. First, it was the garbage cans. I woke up one morning to find mine knocked over, the contents spilling onto my lawn in a mess of plastic and paper. Could have been the wind, but I knew better. Then it was the mailbox. The post had been loosened, tilting it at an awkward angle, like someone had yanked it back and forth in frustration. Still, no proof. Just suspicions. But the real confirmation came 3 nights later. I woke up around 2 a.m., restless, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. I sat up, listening. And then I heard it, a faint clicking sound, barely audible, coming from outside. I threw the covers off, moving quickly to the front window, careful to stay out of sight as I peeked through the blinds. My stomach dropped. Greg was standing near my car, crouched low, fiddling with something near the front tire. My mind snapped into focus, piecing together the situation instantly. He was messing with my car, probably trying to slash my tires or loosen something to cause trouble. The sight sent a surge of anger through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Bursting out of the house in a rage wouldn't do anything except give him what he wanted. No, I needed to be smart about this. I grabbed my phone, snapped a few pictures for proof, then dialed the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher picked up, and I explained the situation in a hushed voice, keeping an eye on Greg the entire time. "You're saying he's actively tampering with your vehicle?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes," I whispered. "I have photos. He's still there." The dispatcher assured me officers would be dispatched immediately. I stayed put, my heart pounding, watching as Greg continued his pathetic attempt at sabotage, completely unaware that he had just made a massive mistake. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Greg stood, seemingly satisfied with whatever he had done, and started walking back toward his house. But before he could reach his front door, flashing blue and red lights lit up the street. He froze. I smiled. He turned just in time to see 2 officers stepping out of their patrol car, hands resting casually on their belts as they approached. I couldn't hear the conversation from inside, but I could see the way Greg's body tensed, the way his shoulders squared as he tried to play innocent. One officer gestured toward my car, saying something that made Greg's face darken. Then they turned toward my house, and I knew it was time to make my move. I stepped outside, calm, collected, while Greg glared at me like I had just ruined his life. Maybe I had. "Sir, can you confirm this is your vehicle?" one of the officers asked. "Yes," I said. "And I have pictures of him tampering with it." I held up my phone, scrolling to the images and handing it over. The officer took a long look before nodding. "All right. We're going to need you to make a statement." I watched as Greg clenched his fists at his sides, his composure cracking under the weight of the situation. He had thought he could get away with it, that he could push me without consequences. But now, he was the one being put in his place. The officers spoke with him for a few more minutes before finally leading him to the patrol car. He wasn't cuffed, but he wasn't free to go either. As they drove away, I finally let out a slow breath. Greg had played his hand, and he had lost. But something told me this wasn't over. He wasn't the kind of person to let something like this go. He'd be back. He'd try again. And next time, I had to be ready. The street felt eerily quiet after the police car disappeared down the road with Greg in the back seat. The flashing lights faded, leaving behind a dim glow from the street lamps, casting long shadows over my driveway. I should have felt victorious, relieved even, but something inside me refused to settle. Greg wasn't the type to take a loss gracefully. He had been humiliated, caught red-handed, and forced to answer for his actions. People like him didn't let things go. They stewed, they plotted, and they waited for their moment to strike. I locked my door that night, double-checked the windows, and set my security camera feed to my phone, just in case. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside made my pulse spike. Every creak of the house had me glancing toward the window. I didn't want to admit it, but Greg had managed to get under my skin. The next morning, I stepped outside, half expecting another passive-aggressive note or some new sign of sabotage, but my driveway was clear, my car untouched. I exhaled slowly, letting my shoulders relax. Maybe, just maybe, the police visit had been enough to scare Greg off. Maybe he'd finally gotten the message that I wasn't someone he could push around. The thought gave me a small sense of peace, until I spotted movement from across the street. A woman I didn't recognize was standing in Greg's front yard, arms crossed, her face twisted in irritation. She wasn't alone. Another man, older, stockier, was pacing near the porch, shaking his head as he muttered something under his breath. Greg was nowhere in sight. Curious but cautious, I walked toward my mailbox, pretending to check for mail while keeping an eye on them. That's when the woman turned her gaze on me, sharp and assessing, before marching straight in my direction. "You the guy who called the cops on Greg?" Her voice was clipped, no introduction, no pretense of friendliness. I stiffened, immediately on guard. "Depends on who's asking." She scoffed, glancing back toward the house like she was debating something. "I'm his sister. That's our uncle over there." She jerked her head toward the older man, who was still pacing, rubbing his temples like he was dealing with the world's worst headache. "Greg's in jail. You happy?" I kept my expression neutral, though a part of me wanted to smirk at the confirmation. "I didn't call the cops on Greg," I corrected. "Greg called them on himself when he decided to mess with my car in the middle of the night." Her lips pressed together in a thin, unimpressed line. "Look, I'm not here to defend what he did. He's an idiot, always has been. But now we're stuck dealing with this mess, and I need to know if you're planning to press charges." That gave me pause. I hadn't really thought that far ahead. When I called the police, my only goal had been to stop Greg from screwing with my car, to put an end to the nonsense. But now, the ball was in my court. If I pressed charges, Greg would have a record. It wouldn't just be a slap on the wrist, it would follow him. Maybe that was exactly what he deserved. Or maybe it would make things worse. People like Greg didn't change just because they got caught. They got angry. They got bitter. I studied his sister for a moment, noting the exhaustion in her eyes. She wasn't here to pick a fight. She wasn't looking for an excuse to defend Greg's actions. If anything, she seemed fed up. "Why are you asking?" I said finally. She let out a slow breath, her gaze shifting away. "Because he's not my problem anymore. He's been living here rent-free for months, mooching off our uncle, refusing to get a job, acting like the world owes him something. This? What he did to you? It's just another example of how he self-destructs and drags everyone else down with him." Her words surprised me. I had always seen Greg as the arrogant neighbor who thought he ran the street, but to his own family, he was a burden. That didn't excuse what he did, not by a long shot, but it did make me rethink how I wanted to handle this. I could press charges and ensure Greg got what he deserved, or I could let him off the hook and leave it up to his family to deal with him. Either way, I wasn't about to let my guard down. I haven't decided yet, I admitted. But let me be clear, if he so much as steps foot on my property again, I won't hesitate. His sister nodded like she expected that answer. Fair enough. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the house, leaving me standing there with a choice I wasn't sure how to make. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the unease lingered. Even if Greg was locked up for now, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And I was right. That night, I was woken up by the sound of my phone vibrating against my nightstand. Half asleep, I reached for it, squinting at the screen. An unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Hello? A long silence stretched on the other end, followed by a breath, slow and deliberate. Then a voice, low and cold. This isn't over. The line went dead. I sat up, fully awake now, my heart pounding in my chest. Greg. It had to be him. Somehow, some way, he had managed to get to a phone, and he wanted me to know that he wasn't done. My hands tightened around the device as my mind raced. I had thought towing his car would be the end of it. I had thought getting him arrested would put a stop to his petty games. But Greg wasn't the type to back down. If anything, he was just getting started. I sat there in the darkness, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. The call had been brief, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. Greg wasn't done. He wasn't the type to take a loss and move on. If anything, being arrested had only made him more determined to make my life miserable. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. He wasn't here. He was still locked up. But the fact that he had gone out of his way to call me, to let me know this wasn't over, meant he had been thinking about it. Obsessing over it. And that worried me. I knew guys like Greg. The kind of people who lived off resentment, who saw every minor inconvenience as a personal attack, who never let things go. He had already crossed the line once. What was stopping him from doing it again? I barely slept that night. Every noise outside had me on edge, every creak of the house made my pulse spike. I told myself I was overreacting. He was in jail, and even if he got out, he wouldn't be stupid enough to do something immediately. He'd have to lay low. Right? By morning, I was exhausted but more determined than ever not to let Greg or his threats control me. If he thought he could scare me, he was wrong. I wasn't going to spend my days looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to strike. I needed to be proactive. The first thing I did was call the police station to check his status. The officer on the phone was polite but firm. Greg had made bail. He was out. My stomach tightened at the confirmation, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had expected this. The question now was what he would do next. By the time I stepped outside to grab my morning coffee from the local shop, I could already feel the shift in the neighborhood. People were watching me. Not openly, but in that subtle way where conversations would pause when I walked by, eyes would linger a little too long before looking away. Greg had been talking. Spreading whatever twisted version of events made him the victim and me the villain. I ignored it. Let them believe what they wanted. I had the truth on my side, and that was all that mattered. But I also knew Greg. He wasn't going to be satisfied with just turning the neighbors against me. He wanted payback. And sure enough, he wasted no time making his move. That afternoon, I walked out to my car and immediately noticed something was wrong. The air around me felt off, like the universe was holding its breath, waiting for me to see it. And then I did. My tires, both of them on the driver's side, completely slashed. The rubber was shredded, deep gashes running through them in jagged lines. My pulse spiked as anger surged through me. I didn't need to ask who had done it. I already knew. My hands curled into fists as I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Greg had escalated. He wasn't just trying to intimidate me anymore, he was actively trying to screw with my life. And I wasn't about to let it slide. I snapped a few pictures for evidence, then dialed the police. Again. This time, when the officer arrived, I skipped the pleasantries. "It's Greg," I said, handing over my phone with the pictures. "He's out of jail, and now my tires are slashed." The officer studied the images, his expression unreadable. "Did you see him do it?" I exhaled sharply. "No. But who else would it be?" He gave me a measured look before jotting something down in his notepad. "We can file a report, but without actual proof, there's not much we can do." My frustration boiled over. "Proof? He called me last night and told me this isn't over. I have that recorded. Isn't that enough?" The officer glanced at me, then at my car. "It's suspicious, sure. But unless we catch him in the act or get footage, it won't hold up." I clenched my jaw, knowing he was right. Greg was playing it smart, just careful enough to avoid getting caught red-handed. I needed something more solid. My mind was already racing, piecing together a plan. "Fine," I said, forcing my anger down. "I'll handle it." The officer gave me a warning look. "Just make sure you handle it the right way. Don't escalate." I didn't respond because we both knew I wasn't going to sit back and let Greg walk all over me. That night, I set up cameras. More of them. Hidden ones. I placed one near my driveway, another near my front door, and one pointed at my car. Greg wanted to play games? Fine. I'd catch him in the act. I barely slept, my adrenaline too high, my mind running through every possible scenario. By the time morning rolled around, I had nothing. No movement. No Greg. It was like he knew I was expecting something. Or maybe he was waiting for me to let my guard down. But on the third night, I got exactly what I needed. The motion sensor on my phone buzzed around 2 a.m., jolting me awake. I grabbed my phone, opened the feed, and there he was. Greg. Dressed in dark clothes, creeping toward my house with something in his hand. A can. Spray paint. My jaw tightened as I watched him shake it, then step toward my garage door. I hit record, every second of his stupidity captured in high definition. I could hear the faint hiss of the paint as he started spraying, big looping letters forming across the surface. It took me a second to process what he was writing. Thief. That was it. That was all I needed. I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone, dialed the police, and this time, I knew they wouldn't just take notes and walk away. I stepped outside, keeping my phone aimed at him. "Hey, Greg." I called, my voice sharp. He froze, mid-spray, turning toward me like a deer caught in headlights. "Smile for the camera." His face twisted in rage, but before he could say anything, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. His expression flickered with panic as he dropped the can and bolted. It was too late. The cops arrived just as Greg was trying to slip back into his house, and this time, he wasn't just getting a warning. I handed over my phone, showing them the footage. The officers took one look before nodding. Within minutes, Greg was in cuffs, his pathetic attempt at an escape completely useless. As they led him toward the patrol car, he shot me a venomous glare. "You think this is over?" he hissed under his breath. I met his stare, unbothered. "Oh, I know it is." The next day, his sister showed up again. She didn't look angry this time, just tired. "He's done," she said simply. "Our uncle's kicking him out. He's going to be someone else's problem now." I nodded, not feeling the least bit sorry. "Good." She sighed, rubbing her forehead. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve all this. I shrugged. Not my first bad neighbor. Won't be my last. She hesitated, then gave me a small nod before walking away. And just like that, Greg was gone. The neighborhood was quiet again. Peaceful. As I painted over the spray paint on my garage door that evening, I let myself finally relax. The battle was over. And for once, I could enjoy my own damn driveway. The quiet felt almost unnatural. After weeks of tension, constant battles, and Greg's relentless attempts to push me over the edge, his absence left a strange void in the neighborhood. No more petty acts of sabotage, no more smug smirks from across the street, no more lurking in the shadows waiting for his next pathetic move. Just silence. Peace. Exactly what I had been fighting for. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had all been too easy. That someone like Greg wouldn't just vanish from my life without leaving behind one final mess. I kept my cameras up. I stayed alert. Even after his sister confirmed he was gone for good, kicked out and forced to find somewhere else to leech off of, I wasn't ready to let my guard down just yet. A week passed, then two, and nothing happened. The tension in my shoulders finally started to ease. Neighbors who had once avoided me started acting normal again. A few even apologized, admitting they had believed Greg's lies until the truth became impossible to ignore. It was strange, seeing the street return to normal as if none of it had ever happened. But I knew better. I had learned something valuable through all of this: people like Greg exist everywhere. There will always be someone who thrives on making life harder for others, someone who can't handle the idea of losing, who will double down on their own misery just to spread it around. The trick isn't to avoid them. The trick is knowing how to deal with them. And I had dealt with Greg in the only way someone like him understands, by showing him that I wouldn't bend, wouldn't break, wouldn't let his pathetic games take control of my life. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that I finally let my guard down completely. I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to come home and not feel the need to check my surroundings, to not scan my car for new damage or look for more threatening notes. But I still felt a deep satisfaction every time I pulled into my driveway, the space clear, exactly as it should be. It was over. I had won. And for the first time in weeks, I truly believed it. Until the letter arrived. It was sitting in my mailbox, tucked neatly between bills and advertisements. No return address. Just my name, scrawled in an all-too-familiar handwriting. My stomach twisted as I pulled it out, unfolding it slowly. No threats this time. No childish insults. Just 3 words. You were right. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for the anger, the paranoia, the frustration to bubble up again. But instead, I just exhaled, shaking my head as I crumpled it in my fist and tossed it into the trash. I didn't know where Greg was, and I didn't care. Maybe he had finally realized he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. Maybe he had moved on to torment someone else. Or maybe, just maybe, he had finally learned his lesson. Either way, he wasn't my problem anymore. That evening, as I sat on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I let the last remnants of the battle fade from my mind. My driveway was clear. My car was safe. My home was mine again. And for the first time in a long time, I could finally enjoy the peace I had fought so hard to protect.